brain drain. I am Folu Storms, and I will be your moderator for this session. Now, each conversation in this series has been designed to empower and equip Africa's millennials with knowledge, which is very important so that we can control our future. And right now, you can catch up also with past millennial conversations on Owando's online platforms. All you have to do is head over to YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You'll find them as Owando PLC. And on Instagram, it's at Owando_PLC. And you can stay connected and keep the conversation going. It will also be streaming live on YouTube. Just use the hashtag A Millennial Conversation. All right. The LinkedIn group, you have a millennial conversation, and that offers members a chance to interact with like-minded individuals who are seeking to become change makers in their respective communities and spaces. So when we think about why it is that Owando bothers to have these sort of conversations, well, it's because for Owando, conversations like these really do help to empower current and future generations. It challenges each and every one of us to think and hopefully to act a little bit differently, while striving to impact our future. And I think we're all very concerned at this point for different reasons. Now, Owando has also been involved in building capacity over the years, which includes collaborating with communities and universities and tech hubs, from the World Economic Forum, global shapers in various universities across the continent, to over 4,000 youth who've benefited from the skill acquisitions programs that have been established by their joint venture partners, NNPC and NAOC, within our host communities, amongst other things. So Owando is really invested in the future of Africa. And I really hope that as you join us, you are as well. Now, to join us in this conversation, I've got to introduce our phenomenal panelists very quickly before we get into the conversation. First of all, Eniola Mafe. She currently leads the growth and development of the 2030 Vision Initiative, focused on harnessing 4IR technologies to accelerate progress on the Sustainable Development Goals within the next decade. Eniola, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Bolu, and thank you for leading this charge.
I'll do my best here. We also have Amal El-Wasif. She is an international relations specialist at the Policy Center for the New South in Morocco. And prior to this, she also worked as program coordinator at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy as well. She's also a former Blue Book trainee in the Directorate General of Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion in the European Commission in Brussels. Amal, thank you very, very much for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be present in this very interesting discussion, and I hope to be able to bring in the view from North Africa on this very important issue.
Indeed. And last but not least, our third finalist is Lajipe Sonwolu. Now, she is a certified human resource professional and a certified human resource leader, as well as a member in good standing with the Immigrations Consultants of Canada Regulatory Council. Now, she did move to Canada, but she's back in Nigeria, and she's also an immigration and mobility consultant at McMaster University, as well as an advocate for positive international student experience. Lajipe has got a very interesting perspective on this topic that we're going to be discussing. So welcome, Lajipe. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Fulu. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Now, a bit of housekeeping for everybody that's joining in this conversation. Do remember that you can drop in your questions. I really want to make sure that this conversation is as fluid as possible, that we are all involved and we are all learning and contributing, because the idea of brain drain is something that affects all Africans, most especially. And thinking of brain drain, what is that? I mean, it's also known as human flight capital. It certainly refers to the large-scale emigration of technical skills. And the African Union estimates that about 70,000 skilled professionals emigrate from the African continent every year. That's a really, really large number. Now, we're going to address during this conversation the causes of brain drain, but we are also going to take a look at the economic impacts, both positive and negative. Now, to start off the conversation, I'm going to jump straight into questions for our panelists. And I think that Amal will probably be the first person that I will throw a question to. when we talk about brain drain, that terminology in itself is something that makes me cringe. It says that everything is leaving the continent, that it's terrible, there's nobody left behind. But there are people here. You are here, Amal, I'm here, and I certainly feel like my brain is good enough to be counted at the end of the day. So can you talk to us a little bit about the narrative surrounding even the use of the term brain drain and how that affects us as young Africans?
Well, thank you very much for your question. I think that you just hit a point that's very, that's very problematic on the question of brain drain, because indeed not everyone agrees that we can call the phenomenon as brain drain. Some people would refer to it as the mobility of skills and capacities, leaving Africa to go abroad. And the thing is that there are a lot of theories about this entire movement, of people, of Africans, of highly skilled Africans leaving for Europe. And when you look at at all the sides of the problematic, then you kind of sense that there is, let's say that there is a reason to have this debate and this discussion about about, let's call it for the purpose of today, brain drain, because the thing is that. Well, while some people think that already the people leaving the country are people who are not, or they will not be being absorbed by the local job market. So some people justify this kind of movement of the fact that the highly qualified people, maybe they did not find the enough opportunities back home, and anyways they were not going to be included in the job market. So them leaving abroad was just a kind of a normal adaptation to the situation that they are living. But actually some other studies have shown that so many people, actually they were having a job in the home country, but yet they decided to go because they wanted to improve their living conditions. And actually what, also in studies, what we kind of, and the concern is that, like the migrants and highly qualified people, they are highly appraised by everyone, regardless of their nationality. So like the countries are looking to have them as people living in their countries and contributing to the economy. But on the other side of the story, the origin countries, maybe they do not offer enough or attractive packages to these people. So it's a kind of competitiveness which is imposed on the origin countries. And this is very problematic because it does impact the development and the industrialization of the home countries, etc. And to this we can come back to this discussion when we hear from other panelists. But something is key to the discussion is that indeed there is no consensus over the terminology of brain drain, and also the entire idea is around this selective migration. This is the problem, this highly selective migration, which can be very costly for the origin countries.
All right, thank you very much for that, Amal. Eniola, I saw you nodding very fiercely as soon as she started going into that. Please do chip in and share your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, thank you, Folu, and thanks for having me. I think the points that Amal had raised certainly talk to this very acute nature of brain drain that has existed in probably historically across Africa, and definitely where I'm based, or sometime based in Nigeria as well. I think even our panelists also represent, all of our panelists kind of represent the different ways that brain drain or brain gain or brain transition, whatever transfers have existed. So, we have Lajikwe, who's from Nigeria, but now is a Canadian citizen, but still has links and is helping others to make that transition if they so wish to. I am more of a repat who is a continuous repat. I shuttle between Europe, the US, and Nigeria, but a lot of my work is focused on Nigerian development. Amal is based in Morocco and working on development issues and policy issues within Morocco. So I think what we're seeing is that even though there is an acute kind of brain drain conversation, which definitely should be addressed, I think the alternative ways and capturing what all of those pathways that different citizens, different people utilize. And I think one of the elements that I definitely want to speak about later is technology. COVID has taught us that, you can move your brain without necessarily moving your body and make money and have income. And what policymakers can actually do in the countries of origin and also in the host countries to ensure that that is beneficial on both sides. I think it also ties into foreign policy for countries like the US and European countries that really benefit from Africans. We're not burdens. we are 1 in 3 doctors in the UK of Nigerian descent, at least. Africans are actually migrating predominantly within Africa. So about 80%, I think crudely, are actually within Africa, only about 8% in Europe. So I think restating the brain drain as a conversation from an African perspective helps us to really understand, one, the pathways that people usually take, both legally and illegally, which we have to recognize. And then secondly, the fact that it's actually a kind of more of a carousel rather than a destination point. And so those are some of the things that I'd be really keen to get feedback from those who are listening, and also, with this great panel here.
Thank you very much for that, Eniola. I mean, both you and Amal have really touched on, you've hit the nail on the head, because, the idea of brain drain is, first of all, just premised on the unconscious belief that Africa is a place that has a shortage of talented people. That's essentially what that phrase is telling us. It also is based somewhat on the strong conviction that Africans belong only in Africa and mustn't go anywhere else. So we've got to take a look at that. Why should Africans not be a part of or tempted by global opportunity, just like anybody else? But that term tends to be used specifically for a continent. So even taking ownership of that term and repositioning it, I think, is very important. Lajipe, obviously you're in here with this, and having been someone that you do help to facilitate people moving across, I think I will direct sort of my next question to you, which is, are there situations where the migration of skilled workers from the continent can be beneficial to the African continent? What are your thoughts on that? And how do you see that movement of skill sets being beneficial to us?
All right. Yeah. So there are lots of benefits to migration. I don't like to call it brain drain because it's really isn't. And like Eniola touched on, it's kind of like a moving, it's not a destination. So people are moving out of the continent, people are moving back into the continent. I have friends who were in Nigeria, moved to Canada, came back to Nigeria, came back to Canada. So there's no destination there to it. I remember reading an article where it was talking about, some of the benefits of brain drain, which I don't like to call it, but I don't know the proper term, the better term. I guess that's part of why we're having this discussion, is that
we'll just say migration. We'll say migration.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just moving around.
So one of the key benefits, which is the field that I'm in, is education. It really does help to provide just a well-rounded education to those people who are, moving. They get to experience something outside of their own culture, something out of their own norms. And so just speaking to the fact that, people generally tend to think of this as Africans, but other countries are also doing this. In my position at McMaster, we have students from UK, we have students from US, India, China, some countries that I've never even heard of. We have students coming there, and some of them stay after they complete their studies, and some of them go back to their home country, and they're able to implement changes and bring, some of those things that they've seen in Canada, they're able to, use that to develop themselves. Some other, advantages to migration are also exports. So, for example, let me not use Nigeria again. Let's use Ethiopia. If you have a group of Ethiopians in UK, for example, after a while they're going to start looking at how to bring their own culture, their own food, their own things. They're going to start shipping, their items. So it really does foster exports between those countries. Another thing as well is that foreign exchange. So definitely, even if you leave your country, you still have family here. You're not, it could be your grandma, it could be your uncle, it could be your auntie. And so you find that a lot of people who leave are constantly sending money back home. And even apart from that, some of them do decide to invest in businesses. So yes, it seems that people are leaving, but there's also advantages to that. And really, my take is more of, how do we maximize those benefits while minimizing the cost of migration?
Okay, I like that. How to maximize the benefits while minimizing the cost, because there is a real cost. I will say that in Nigeria, especially at this time, there are a lot of very pressing socioeconomic reasons that are forcing people who would otherwise have never considered, people who otherwise would never have considered migrating, or maybe considered it as sort of a distant, it might be nice. And because of economic reasons, for security reasons, and these are very real reasons that we have to address why people are migrating and why they're moving. How does one address that? How does one almost stop a run on the bank, so to speak? Should there just be a run on the bank? Should we all say, well, nobody knows, let's just japa, because that is the term. And that's the term, big shout out to my Gen Zs and, my elder millennials out here as well, who are using this term, but it is real. And I would love anyone who wants to chip in. What would you say to people who are really in that space of, dare I say, fear and concern for their futures? How do you address that?
Maybe I can, because I kind of operate in this policy world, maybe I can just kind of give at least some thoughts there. One thought on this is obviously with migration, temporary migration, migration for life, whatever it would be. I think the brain drain is a cause of a lack of policy and thinking and strategy by leaders, and also at the personal level by the individuals, to understand what is at play. So it's great that we have Lajipe on the panel, because she's helping usher through those to make a valued decision on whether migration is for you or not, right? So the locations you would take for migration, and primarily economic migration, I'm leaving out refugee and displaced people and asylum seekers for now. But on the economic side, you make a decision, you hear from an uncle or a brother that they are now living in Italy. You don't know how they got to Italy. You haven't spoken to them about the fact that they are still owing debts to the person who brought them there, whether legally or illegally. You don't know what kind of job they have, because all you're hearing is that they're earning in euros. And that's just, as long as, let's say, the exchange rate to any of our currencies, barring maybe a couple across the continent, is always going to win out, right? So the global system is always going to win out. So you hear that, and then you use that to base your entire safety, security of your life on. And I think that is a shame, because migration, as we know, is okay. Temporary migration, whatever it is. The problem is, and where the real brain drain is that we are wasting doctors and potential nurses and lawyers' time floating across the Mediterranean in many cases, or having to relearn, take an LLM if they're lawyers, or have to pass certain bars, certifications. It still doesn't translate. I come from a family, two parents who migrated twice to the UK and also to the US. And I know what they went through to get there. So I think one of the things around the information gap, and this is where obviously technology helps, information that is widely available on these websites is also good. I think also the other side is that we know that there are push and pull factors. So the pull factor is that there's opportunities and economic opportunities. The push factor is what I think we miss, which is that in many countries, they do not have enabling environments for young people to thrive and be able to fill their potential as human beings and productive members of society. And that is no fault of theirs. If you go to school for 4 years in a university and you're found that you do not have any skills, and we've been in Uber drives with people, with young people, and you hear their stories. And there's a guy who I met a couple of years ago He could tell me everything about financial. He was the one who told me about crypto 4 years ago. He's driving an Uber in Lagos, and he had to queue up in a line just for that Uber car, to be able to work. He had to do multiple tests to be an Uber driver, even though he had studied finance, and he could be in any bank at any point in time. But at the same time, we have $1.3 billion supporting startups in this country. We obviously have a disconnect because we're seeing opportunities, but they're not getting to the people. And that many cases is both leadership, both private sector and public sector. And we need to have a conversation about decreasing the push factors for professionals, for those skilled, unskilled. I hate the word unskilled, because our plumbers and our plumbers and our maintenance people,
skilled people.
They're
very skilled in many ways. Okay.
So,
I mean, Anila, you've given us a lot to think about as well, how to mitigate those push factors. And you're right, there are opportunities. And that links me to a question that's already come in. Please do remember that if you are watching us and if you joined, welcome. It's a conversation surrounding what is colloquially termed as brain drain. We're going to refer to it as migration. But again, at the start of this conversation, we did point out that that term brain drain tends to refer almost exclusively sometimes to the African continent. And it is quite detrimental in the way that the narrative is phrased, because it implies that there are not talented and skilled people on the African continent, which is false. Because when you go anywhere in the world, you will find a number of Africans who are excelling and exceeding in different areas. And they were doing so to an extent at home, but there are push factors, as Anila has just spoken about, that forces people to seek what they think are better opportunities. I've got an anonymous attendee who sent in a question through the Q&A box, so please do send in your questions, and says, don't you think that brain drain applies to only countries where these brains can be put to work, or maybe can't? I think the word brain drain is for a region with opportunities for these brains, and that they can't find them because they are all leaving. For a region where these brains can't be used, then it isn't brain drain, it's just people migrating. Very interesting there. Okay. We also have Grace Oluchi, who says the inter-African migration, pointing to that Grace Oluchi says she's worked and lived in almost 12 African countries, but never in Europe or America. The exchange and transfer of skills is amazing. And that's something we've referenced quite a bit here. But there are other issues to address as well. So excuse me. So let me just dive into a few more. We've got another question that's coming through the audience that says the audience here, mainly people migrating through the right means, the likes that leave Nigeria through the federal skilled worker / experienced class to other countries. These ones go on and work professionally abroad. And that's the audience we should be speaking about when we talk of brain drain, and not those going illegally by sea. Very interesting. What do you guys think about that? Amal, would you like to comment on this? Talking about, well, there's the skilled workers, they're the ones who are the brain drain, but unskilled, or what is termed as unskilled work. I mean, essentially what it feels like is the attendee says, who cares? What are your thoughts, Amal?
Well, I totally agree, because the entire thing is about the narrative that's created. Each time that we hear about Africa, it's all the time about, the hundreds or the way that they want us to understand that there are so many people, or that the Africans, let's say the low-skilled Africans are submerging Europe and they are arriving illegally. But how about speaking about actually people who were trained in African countries, and for which the African governments have spent so much money so that they became doctors and engineers, and then they ended up leaving for Europe. And it was really interesting for me to hear what Laipi has said. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name in the right way, and also what Inyola has said, because the thing is that we're not speaking about mobility in general. I myself have studied in the US, and I studied in Europe before settling down in Morocco. But the thing is that we're speaking about a specific kind of migration. And yes, I do feel the kind of the resentment and the feeling of low-skilled people for which we're not speaking, and they are actually very active people contributing in the home countries and contributing abroad. I'm of course against this discrimination, because at the end of the day, everyone is making their contribution to the country, and you cannot get paid and you cannot have incomes if you're not working. So either you're low-skilled or high-skilled, and even the scale of describing the competences can be very subjective, because it's not that you have a PhD or master that you are, you are academically highly qualified, but that does not mean that another person who's performing a service and who's being very performant is not skilled. So this is a whole other discussion. And as Inula mentioned, the push and pull factors and everything that some people cannot find in the home countries, I don't think, I do agree, and I recognize that this is a big part of the problem, but this should not be taken as what it is, and we should not think that we cannot act on this. And to come back, if you allow me, to the first question that you raised after the intervention of Lajib. So you said, how can we do, and what can we do to mitigate?
Yes.
Lajib, okay, to mitigate this brain drain versus brain gain. How can we gain from this kind of mobility? Let's call it that way. There are a lot of studies and analysis, and people who were interested into the question, they say that you have, there is a threshold. Actually, whenever the remittances, which is a very powerful channel by which the migrants and the diaspora, they are benefiting their home countries through sending money to their relatives and family, so that they help to combat poverty. But then the thing is that if the remittances, they do not constitute at least 5% of the GDP, it means that the brain drain versus the brain gain equation is not working. It means that the government has spent way too much on these people who ended up leaving, that what they actually brought back to the country. So this is something that we as Africans should pay attention to. Do we really get from remittances that much money to mitigate what the government spent on the education of highly skilled people? And I can give you an example. A country like Tunisia, which is in North Africa, spent as much as 24% from the GDP on education. And so many people of this, and specifically the case of doctors, is very problematic in Tunisia, because so many of them end up leaving for France. To the point that when the entire pandemic of COVID-19 started, the government had to call for these doctors and ask them to come back temporarily, enable to support the efforts of the governments to mitigate the situation of COVID-19. And I think this is very, we all feel sorry to see this kind of shortages, knowing that the countries worked hard to train doctors in the country. For the case, for example, of Morocco, and I will conclude with this point, and I think it's very important for us to give illustrations. For example, in sensitive sectors like the case of the medical sector in Morocco, if you have been trained in public schools to become a doctor, then you have to work, at least for the government, like to work 6 years, or I think it's 6 or 8 years. And then you can either go to the private sector or you can migrate, because somehow you have to return back a part of what has been spent on your education. This is the entire, spirit of working on this specific question of skills mobility.
Thank you for that, Amal. Lajipe, I know you're itching to share something with us, especially because you do play in that education space as well. So please do share your thoughts.
All right, thank you. I'll start with just from what Amal was talking about. One of the things that we've seen at my school is that some countries actually offer scholarships to students to come to Canada, get a degree, and then there is a caveat to it where they have to return to their home country and put that to use either for a year or two. So those are very good ways of exploring the benefits of migration, just to talk on that. So someone had talked about, skilled workers or, professional workers not going to drive Uber or not going to do menial work. And that's actually not true. So the fact that you've migrated as a skilled worker does not necessarily mean that you're going to get a job as a skilled worker. And one of the many conversations that I have with my clients when they're looking to move is that you have to be prepared. Everybody's experience is different. You could have the exact same work experience degree with someone, and they could get a job in a week, and you could get a job in 2 years. Like, everyone's experience is different. So, the fact that you're skilled, and some of the countries that even have this migration program don't necessarily have, settlement programs to help these migrants, get proper jobs. I've seen doctors doing cleaning, driving Uber. So, that's just something to be aware of, that everyone's process is different. Some people have to go back to school and start all over again, even though they were a manager in their home country, just to get into the system. And some others will get there and within a week or two, they've gotten a job and, everything's going so well for them. So everyone's experience is always different. And it's just good to have be aware of how that can play out. For example, if you're migrating to Canada, you're required to show proof of funds. And a lot of people think it's just about putting money in your account, and it's not. It's the government wants to know that you have money to support yourself for a year in case you're not able to, get a job on time, that you're going to be, you have money to pay your rent, buy food, and take care of yourself within that adjustment period. So they ask for 1 year proof of funds. The other thing that I was going to talk about was just in terms of orientation. So we call them unskilled work, but again, I talk about Canada a lot because obviously that's where I've been for the past 15 years or so. In Canada, they're called skilled trades. They're not called unskilled work, they're called skilled trades. And you actually have to get certifications and all of that to be, a carpenter or a plumber or a bricklayer and stuff like that. And in my work, I find that it's typically harder for Africans to tap into the skilled trades migration because we don't have that certificate. We don't have that appreciation for that kind of work. Where in Canada, if my sink is broken and I call a plumber just to come to my house, they're going to charge me $100 just to come to the house to tell me that the sink is broken. And then they'll tell me how much it's going to cost to fix it. And then per hour, charge per hour. So it's also more of our orientation and how we feel about those kind of skills. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lajipe. I think you touched on some very, very important issues. Just taking a look at, this last point that you raised about skilled trade, also calling a plumber in the UK is, it's fear. You'll be afraid in your hearts because they're going to charge you a lot of money. It's more money. The plumbers, I think, earn better than a lot of the lawyers, and that's something to consider. And I say that to say that perhaps, especially for the millennials, everyone that's watching this, is the way that we move forward and the way that we move the continent forward is also by reshaping how we talk about things, how we think about things, what we prize. At the end of the day, we do need very skilled mechanics. We do need very skilled plumbers. We need all these skills. And here there are so many people who are incredibly skilled, and beginning to value that could be really useful for us and could bring in a lot to the continent as well. Taking control of the narrative is key. But also, speaking of taking control of the narrative, there's a very interesting, within a private capacity, a South African-based company called Homecoming Revolution. And they describe themselves as a brain gain company for Africa. That is in helping Africans to move back to the motherland through efforts such as matchmaking events with prospective employers and advice on housing and readjustment. And I wonder if for our panelists, as well as those who are listening and watching, do you think that initiatives like these will achieve the desired effect? Will it help to reshape the narrative? Will it help to position the way that we here at home see opportunities? Because I don't think enough discussion is also had about the people who leave the African continent and then come back, of which they are in their droves. We tend to publicize in the media and we tend to hype because of fear people who are afraid and are leaving because they think there are better opportunities. And I know that all our panelists sort of touched on this in different ways, but they're not paying attention to the policies that exist in some of these countries, especially non-African countries that do not favor Africans. They do not. Seun Kuti posted recently on his Instagram page, and I've got to share because I thought it was such an interesting post, where he says, they say the future is Africa is the future, but are they saying that Africans are the future? Because they will take over your continent and you'll be left behind. So what are we doing to position ourselves to change that narrative, to perhaps be involved in policy making, in decision making? I think that's a very important thing to address as well. So I just wonder again, do any of the panelists want to address this question of initiatives like this Homecoming Revolution that the South African-based company is pushing, this brain gain for Africa? Do you think such initiatives could achieve the desired effect? Lajipe, should we start with you?
Yes, fine. So, I mean, I think I myself, I'm probably a perfect example of this with, coming back and looking forward. And I think like those kind of initiatives can be very beneficial, especially because, so for someone like me who has an option, if I'm here for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and nothing's happening, guess what? I'm going to pack my bags and go back. Right. But if there are initiatives that help with settling in, not just even looking for work, it could be starting a business. You've been away for so long, you don't know how things are done. You don't know the process of getting things done. So I think like those kind of initiatives can be very, very beneficial, especially, when I was talking about maximizing the benefits. So not everyone's going to go abroad and stay there. Some people won't like the cold. Some people won't like the loneliness. Some people just want, they just want to experience something different for a few years, and, their country will always be home to them. So again, like you were saying, a lot of times people tend to focus more on, oh, everyone's leaving. No, not everyone's leaving, and not everyone can leave. There are people who want to leave and won't be able to leave. But then, this kind of initiatives can really help with settling in those who leave and come back, and, helping them maximize that experience that they've had and how they can, use that to develop their own space, their own country, and bring better ideas to the country. I think, again, I talked about this before, but one thing I'm going to talk about again is where governments are using scholarships to send people abroad to learn things and bring them back and help with policy making and things like that.
Thank you. Eniola, speaking on policy, I know this is where you thrive and you flex, so please share it with us, because we also have a flood of comments and questions in there, but please do talk to us. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I tried to skim through so that I could make it a little bit pointed to some of the points that were raised in the chat and the Q&A. One point that really looked up, which was that, to address the conversation about policy, and I really mean policy as in basically an intervention by leaders and anyone in the private and public sector. So policy is not something distant away from everyone. It affects our lives. We know social media bill, we know the Twitter ban in Nigeria, we know all of these things affect our daily lives. So just wanted to mention that. But one point that was raised, which was that the circumstances that for sake of telling my age, but I'm 37, which means that I'm on the tail end of like the millennial. It also means that I saw, I think it was raised by Helen Amore as well, which was that, for example, in Nigeria and across the board, we heard Africa rising. The US was not the place to be 2008. It was a financial crisis. I was working on Wall Street at the time. I looked around, I was like, hey, these people, they don't know what they're doing. I need to jackpot. So I was jackpotting from the US. So like jackpot can go either way sometimes. I was like, these people are crazy. They're crazy. I want to go and work on something that is actually more meaningful. And so when I was looking, I looked at Nigeria because number one, the multiples were exceedingly high. Policy direction seemed to be going in the right direction. Nigeria's stance in the world was pretty decent at the time. There was leadership. I think someone had mentioned there's no examples of leadership and role models. That I couldn't get rid of Nigerian role models at the time. Some of them have been sullied now. Some of them have been put in the mix of things and may not be the entrepreneurs that we may want to exemplify, but they did exist, right? So in all of this, we have to understand the context. The context that a lot of Gen Zers are facing right now is a very confused, complex world, right? It was way easier. I didn't have much Facebook and much Instagram. There's no feeling of FOMO, the fear of missing out constantly, that like, look at your mates, see your mates. There's a lot of pressure that generations after my generation are dealing with. Plus insecurity, plus the idea of mobility has changed. Mobility now is that essentially now is that you have been vaccinated by a US or European country, and secondly, that you have a degree that can be translatable and they can pronounce the name of the university or the school that you went to, and that you have some level of phoneme that like sounds a little bit maybe like me rather than maybe some of my cousins. So like there's a whole different sphere of work, that a sphere of context that I think we're dealing with that makes it really hard fundamentally for young people to have mobility. And mobility means freedom to be able to move based on your interests and the opportunities that are out there. And I think that it's generally limited across the board. I think what policy can do on the country of origin side is, one, acknowledge that this happens and stopping people from going into what I called earlier, and I want to correct myself about illegal migration, and it came up. We can't look down on illegal migration. Any one of us is a bad policy, a bad decision by a leader away from a failed state, right? So South Africa is doing pretty decently now. Nigeria is not. Kenya may be doing well tomorrow. Morocco may be not doing well the next day. So let's be honest about the fact that no one knows what's going to happen in our future, but what we want is the freedom to be able to move and make decisions on our lives that affect our bottom line and the ability to provide for our families and ourselves and do so safely. So that means that when we talk to our politicians, our leaders in the private and public sector, we need to hold them to account, right? In the creative industry, I mean, Folu, you know more than I do, has been attacked fundamentally because of incomes, crypto, finance bills, all sorts of things that are frustrating our new level of entrepreneurs from achieving. And then we turn around, millennials, Gen, the people above me, I don't know, the 40 and ups, they start looking at us and saying, you guys are not doing enough. Well, the circumstances that young people these days are operating in is significantly harder than even the one I was operating in at the same time. And I think an acknowledgement of that and supporting people who choose to leave and want to come back, providing pathways to come back, like you mentioned, these companies exist. Government should be supporting them, should be giving them subsidies, should be having databases of people who are leaving the countries. China and India both do this. Universities, the top universities in China and India say, okay, you want to go off and work at Google, right, you're going to come right back. Much of China's technological advancement in the past 10 years was because of those people who came back from Silicon Valley, had learned all of the stuff. They didn't have any IP rules. So basically they just stole everything else and then just applied it in China. I'm not saying that I condone stealing information or anything like that, but I'm saying the act of saying we are in the interest of our country. If they go, let them go, but let's create pathways for them to come back if they choose to do so. If they don't, let us have relationships, and I did my master's thesis on this, which was diaspora relationships with the home country are extremely important beyond remittances. They provide bridges. I play a role as a bridger. They provide risk mitigation strategies. They provide other alternatives of models. You now have doctors from Africa all over the world who have seen what COVID has done. Let's have a conversation, bring those African doctors to say, hey, how is it turning up in these countries that you're working in? Let's have a conversation on how we can bring back some of these best use cases for African nations. That's simple. Call them up, but we don't have databases to show who has left and who has the skills. Let's acknowledge that and let's use technology to be able to do that rather than frustrating every single African known to man who has ever walked life from trying to do what is fundamentally a fundamental right, which is providing sustenance for their own and themselves, like simply as.
And Eniola, like I think you've touched on so many key points, and you can see people like Mohammed Elama in there saying that yes, migration is a fundamental part of the human journey, and even wildlife too. Living beings will forever move from one location to another. That is just going to happen. People are always seeking better for themselves. We also have Helen, who's very active in the comment section. Thank you very much for that, Helen, saying that the attraction for reverse migration or homecoming is a good and flourishing economy in a safe environment with attractive opportunities. Again, Eniola, you touched touched on that, looking at policies. Your young people cannot live in fear if you are instilling policies that have young people who are trying to create a way for themselves in this new world that is changing so rapidly. Every day, I feel like something else is happening and we're learning and growing. It will affect the ability of young Africans to continue to flourish and thrive. We have a comment in here from Tony Oko, who says he thinks the main issue is with the standard of living. He talks about the Nigerian situation specifically, saying that he was a bank manager in Nigeria before he left for the US. You know, he has a brother who's with him who was a doctor. Money was not a motivator. It was not money. All they wanted was the basic minimum of security, access to quality healthcare, quality education, economic stability, and sound leadership. And sadly, comments from the current leadership in Nigeria, I believe Tony speaking specifically, shows that they don't seem to care that very much, that they don't seem to care as much as the private sector does. And that is definitely a big issue. I'm going to address a few more of the comments that have come in. We have this anonymous attendee. I believe, Eniola, you've answered this already, but for the sake of argument, I'll read it out, who says, I totally agree with you that there is an illusion in expectations like salary source and size coupled with the exchange rate, but exclamation mark, I don't think we are wasting skilled people. We are deploying them to regions where they are needed. The African economy doesn't seem to need them because they have more than required. It's human capacity deployment, if you ask me, says our anonymous attendee. So I want to address this next point, and I know we've touched on it a little bit. And Amal, maybe you can talk to this. Do you believe that the promotion of intra-African migration, which is often hindered by regional regulations, again, we've spoken about policy on worker mobility, can do more to tackle this migration or brain drain issue that the continent faces, right? So the promotion of intra-Africa migration, it's often hindered by regulation and worker mobility, but can they do more to tackle the brain drain issue?
Definitely. I do think that promoting interregional mobility could be potentially another way to actually ensure that the mobility happens within the region and benefits other African countries. And it's going to be easier for the people because they will be in the same region. It's far easier for them to go back home, etc. But the thing is that in a lot of the sub-regions of Africa, the economies can be very similar. So if you cannot find good conditions in your country, maybe you don't necessarily find what you are aspiring for in the next neighboring country. And this is actually interesting. Your question is interesting because there is a kind of a study framework which speaks about intervening opportunities. And this means that a person living their country of origin and they initially wanted, for example, to go to Europe, if they find an intervening opportunity or better conditions in a country like Morocco, in a country like Senegal, they might end up living in these countries. So at the end of the day, whenever you are an economic migrant and you're seeking to improve your conditions, you don't necessarily stuck to your initial idea of leaving for Europe. If you find better in the way, then you can stay in the destination that you find this thing, I mean, the better opportunity. And we have examples. I mean, South Africa is obviously the most obvious example of a selective African country, which was doing selective migration of highly qualified people, etc. But then when the conditions changed, and this is something that I wanted to highlight, is that in generally the migrants are unfortunately is the weaker kind of component of society, is among the vulnerable populations. Whenever there is an economic crisis, it is directly reflected on the living of the migrants. And so many governments, I mean, in Europe or even in Africa, they tend to be inward looking. Whenever there is an economic crisis or something, it's the first or among the first people to be kind of penalized by the economic situations are migrants. So this is a reality. And regulation-wise, and I can give you the example of East Africa, which is one of the best regions in terms of regional integration and in terms of mobility of the workers. So in East Africa, for example, and I'm not speaking about of after the COVID-19 crisis, where the mobility has is becoming more constrained. We've seen that there is a certain fluidity between countries like Tanzania, Kenya, and the drivers would come from Tanzania and then go to Kenya easily. I mean, this is one of the most integrated regions on this regard. West Africa as well is a very good example with a hub, which is Nigeria and also Cote d'Ivoire. So I think that we do have examples, but once again, the realities are very difficult, because if you're living, or if you really aim to another standard of living, you might not find what you necessarily want in the next neighboring country. So I think we definitely can improve the conditions of mobility through having real agreements and encouraging this mobility. And there's also another point I wanted to mention, is that we've spoken about remittances, and Eniola has mentioned that very in such a nice way. But the cost of remittances is already high from European countries towards Africa, but it's higher within Africa, between African countries. So I think that we can act on very specific areas to improve the mobility. And if we work on this, I think that we will definitely make a change on this specific point.
Thank you for that. And that's so important, because we do have to work on something. The point of having these conversations is so that we can take action in our small little ways, and we can begin to inform the type of continent we want to see in the future. I know it's very easy sometimes when the problems are popping up and you're like, well, the world isn't quite making the sense that it should. It's very easy to dwell in the negative and to just live in that fear. But we have to take these conversations and see how we can apply them, how we can expand our narrative, expand our worldview, and expand opportunities, really, because at the end of the day, it is human. It is important that people are able to live the way they choose to live, that they have certain opportunities. We've got a bunch more questions coming in. Tunde Rema is asking something that I think we addressed earlier on, but he may have missed it. He said, what can be done differently to reduce some of these push factors? Because the irony is that we pay more to even learn in other countries, because those international student fees, what? Oh my goodness, especially now the exchange rate is tough. Is tough. So just very quickly, just touching on from the fee perspective, maybe Logically, what can be done to reduce some of those push factors in your opinion? Just 1 or 2 points.
Okay, I think Eniola kind of touched on this earlier. It's more about policy and, not just the government, but in general, because like everyone said, yes, some people will leave, but for some people, it's because they don't have a choice, and they just look for a better options for themselves. Like I think it was Tony that was sharing his experience. So mitigating those push factors will start from policies and changes. Insecurity is a big one. Health is a big one. I've experienced some friends having really bad health scares, and the health system, that's another topic on its own. But I know a lot of people that have literally relocated because they had a bad health experience, and they decided that it wasn't worth it for them to continue to stay here. So there's so many factors. Really, and it's not a one person thing. It's more of a continuous conversation and finding out, how do we make it more conducive for those who choose to stay, or those who are not necessarily looking to Japa, but are having to are having to move for other reasons. So that's what I have to contribute.
Thank you. Eniola, speaking a little bit more to policy and of course the African Continental Trade Agreement, which is a huge factor in helping intra-continental migration. What are your comments on that? Because I know that when it had come up in Nigeria, every time it makes the news in a way, people get a little bit sketchy. You have a lot of people who are on the side for it. They're like, yes, it's going to open things up. And other people saying, no, we're going to be flooded with, goods that are not helping. It doesn't make sense. I mean, what are your thoughts? Where can, Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials, where can everybody sit in a comfortable space that will help us actively work together cohesively to make this continent better and to make our countries better? What are your thoughts on that?
No, thanks, Folu. Actually, what Amal had mentioned in her comment sparked, I just remembered something that happened that actually does relate to this. And it didn't connect with me before. But within the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which is obviously everyone knows about it, and had just been ratified, I think, at the beginning of this year or last year. COVID has just made years all the same for me. But it was ratified recently. But one thing we have to remember, and really only the people who worked within policy actually were able to know what was happening. So the Africa Free Trade Agreement was based on the European Union model generally. And one of the key pieces of the European Union, we know this with Schengen, which is the free movement of people and persons. So everyone agreed generally that within the Africa context, which was already hard enough to get everyone to sign up on the free trade agreement, which means goods and services, right? And so there's still provisions that still need to be worked through. There's a long roadmap till 2030. One of the pieces that I think is really valuable here for this conversation and what Gen Y, Gen Z can do, because let's be honest, millennials, sometimes we're a bit tired, and sometimes we're also part of the system itself. And so we've seen that much of the revolutionary thought and thinking has really come from Gen Z and Gen Y now. But one thing I would charge my aburos to do is really just the movement of people and persons was only ratified by small countries, because obviously they benefit from it, right? So countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa did not agree to this. But what we know is that there's an Africa kind of visa openness report. I think it's 2020, I just brought it up. And it said that countries that relaxed visa regimes and adopted visa-free and visa-on-arrival policies have seen economic benefits in recent years, attracting growing numbers of business and leisure travelers, right? So some of this is also people who travel for temporary visas to work, or maybe doing consultancy and all of that. You know how it is with movement of people, just even when you want to go and do a small japa for 3 days to anywhere outside of like ECOWAS, SADC or whatever, and how hard it is to do that. So I think we've got to take a leaf out of the book of like Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, a lot of the Eastern African countries, and really push for this movement of people and persons, because I think that's going to be really important, because as I said earlier, 80% of African migration happens intra. So that means we're dealing with a large caption of people like who may not be, or may not choose, or may not be lucky enough to do the US and the other border japa. So that's also another thing, and it has real benefits for the countries, both receiving and sending. It also has benefits for individuals, so the cost of migration isn't high. I mentioned earlier that my family moved to the UK with thanks from a Commonwealth Commonwealth visa, and then we're also able to move from the UK to the US through the Visa card lottery. And I'm saying this not to boast or anything, but to say those things don't exist anymore. Those mechanisms don't exist anymore. And so I think we've got to look for new mechanisms, and that's not for the individual to figure out. It's for our leaders, our corporations, many of the large multinationals who are moving their employees across their jurisdictions as well, and to support that constantly.
Thank you for that, Eniola. And I think that's a very good place for us to get ready to round up, because I mean, we could spend a long time on this topic. We all know because it's dear to our heart. But we have Mohammed Elama, who's been commenting, and he says, and I think he hits the nail on the head here. He says, vote, vote, vote. Go get your voters card. Mobilize your peers to do the same, because the role that millennials play is very important. Someone has said that we need to get these voters cards because being meaningfully involved in the political system means that you can affect the policies that are moving forward, all right? Talking about it alone is not going to fix it. We've all got to chip in and do something. So no matter how tired we may be sometimes, getting that voters card, just making sure you're doing the research, even if you can't get out to vote, just doing your research on political office holders or people who are seeking to get into office so that they can place policies, and informing people who do have the energy to go out, informing the Gen Z who are willing. They're the restless generation. They're the ones who will not take it lying down. Empower young people, empower us so that we have a future to look forward to. It's not enough to just say it's tough, it's difficult, the system doesn't work. We know that already. This is how we start taking little steps towards adjusting it. This is how we influence the kind of country and continent that our children and our grandchildren, and nieces and nephews are going to live in. Of course, migration will happen, it's standard, but we do have to choose our office holders. That is the very baseline. So Mohammed, thank you very much for bringing that forward. And I'd love to just check in with our panelists, Amal and Lajipe, Eniola. Do you have any final quick words just to leave our viewers with before we round up this conversation?
Yeah, so it's been a very interesting conversation, and like you were just saying, talking about it alone is not going to, it's not going to fix it. We have to take action. But I was going through the comments, and I saw one from Ayatollah Jago, and just talking about the fact that, would we do better economically if these brains were to stay in their countries without an enabling environment for maximizing their potential and allowing them to contribute within their own countries? And I think that's just a very, very important question, and probably just summarizes my own view on the migration topic, is that, yes, brain drain, but if this individual were to stay where they are, what benefit would they contribute to that country if they're not able to get a job, if they're not, if they're not safe, if they're not healthy? Really excited, or really excited to see what happens next, after these conversations, and the more conversations that it will bring, and hopefully changes also that will accompany that. And thank you very much for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you, Lajipe. I appreciate that. Amal, would you like to chip in anything just before we leave?
Yes, well, thank you very much for this very interesting and exciting conversation about, again, what a very complex and complicated question of skills mobility, let's name it that way. And I would also want to conclude my participation by a comment that I've seen, and I wanted to respond to it, but very quickly. So someone was actually mentioning that, yes, it's good to have infrastructures and ways to integrate back the diaspora, but it should not happen at the expenses of people who have studied in the home countries, because he said, I did not get enough, or I was not admitted to higher positions because my master's is not from the UK or from the USA. So this is something I would also want to insist on. It is very interesting to ensure the scientific transfer of skills, but that should not happen at the expense of people who, for some reason, decided to stay in the country or could not go abroad, because this will only create tensions. So let's think on this specific point, but in an inclusive way. And thank you very much once again for the panel.
Fantastic, Amal. Thank you. And Eniola, would you like to just round up?
Yeah, I'll do it very quickly. To those who are listening, who are like millennials, Gen Z, Gen Y, do your research. Your decision about where you go and how you go, and the decision about your life is yours to make. And then utilize your network, utilize, avenues like this. I don't want to put anyone on the panel on the spot. Reach out, understand what makes sense for you in where you are and what you can do. For those who are leaders, both in private sector and public sector who may be listening, we need to break that silence. There were reasons why we migrated or did not migrate. We need to talk to younger people about the good, the bad, and the ugly about migration from a personal perspective. And then also try to be, when we are in those rooms that we are lucky enough to do because we went to school and we are in influential positions of power to both influence, whether it's policy, influence decisions that corporates make about their hiring practices and others. Speak up and understand. You are the risk mitigation strategy for those who are younger, who are going through a really complex time in this day and age. And I wouldn't wish this environment on someone starting their career out. But I think that they have both the fortitude to be able to do it. And I think the dividends are going to be excellent. And then also for the broader leaders is that think about migration as an opportunity and have it be regulated in smart ways.
Thank you so much for that. Our panelists have been phenomenal. I want to thank you again personally and deeply for contributing to this conversation. And to everybody watching, don't forget to join the LinkedIn group, A Millennial Conversation. The link is now in the chat box to get a heads up on conversations like this. Also follow Oando PLC on relevant platforms. And don't forget that in spite of the pandemic and the confluence of unfortunate events that followed, the hashtag Humans of Oando came together back in April 2021, months ago, to launch a response to the hunger challenges in Nigeria, because there's so many issues facing us. It's called TAP, T-A-P. It's the aggregator platform, because approximately 87 million Nigerians live in extreme poverty. Approximately 50% of our population cannot afford to eat. And despite the efforts of many NGOs and charities to provide what palliatives they can, a huge gap still exists between those who are in dire need and those eventually reached and fed. So TAP was created to address and bridge that gap. And the objective is to amplify all the charities that exist and to help reach each community one at a time and to bridge that gap between the fed and unfed. So please join the hashtag Humans of Oando to help eradicate hunger in Nigeria, one community at a time. Go to the website. It's taptoreachall.org. On Twitter and Instagram, it's Tap to Reach All. I've been Folu Storms. This has been a phenomenal millennial conversation on brain drain. I want to thank you all and wish you a fantastic rest of your day. Goodbye.